The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the neighborhood. I stood in the backyard, the smell of sizzling burgers and faint chatter from the gathering family members filling the air. It was a typical summer evening, one of those evenings where the world felt easy, almost effortless. Yet, in the midst of all the laughter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It was the way he was looking at me, the way his eyes lingered a moment too long. I had known Alex for years, lived next door to him for as long as I could remember, but tonight felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. As I watched him interact with the rest of the guests, the sound of the grill and the clink of glasses barely registering in my mind, I realized I had never noticed how tall he had gotten, how his smile made something stir deep within me. For a while, I told myself it was just a passing thought, something that would fade as quickly as it came. I had never looked at Alex like that before, but tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the way his laughter seemed to vibrate in the air, or the way he reached out to steady me when I almost tripped on the garden hose. He had always been there, always had that easygoing charm, but tonight I felt something shift. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. This was a family gathering, after all. But when our eyes met across the yard, I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something unsaid, something building between us. It was subtle, a brush of the fingers here, a shared glance there. But it was there. I tried to focus on the conversations around me, on the familiar faces of cousins and aunts, but my thoughts kept returning to Alex. Was it possible? Could I really be feeling this way about my neighbor? About my childhood friend? The world around me felt oddly distant, the noises muffled as my heart began to race. Every time I looked at Alex, I felt like the space between us had lessened. I was no longer sure of the distance between us, or whether it was just me. The evening seemed to stretch on forever as I tried to make sense of the strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Was this just a momentary lapse in judgment? Or was there something deeper lurking beneath the surface? And what would happen if I let myself explore it? This wasn't just a regular barbecue. I knew that now. It was a turning point. I just didn't know what it would mean for both of us yet. Alex had always been a part of my life. Growing up, our houses were separated by just a fence, and we spent countless afternoons running around, playing video games, or sitting on the porch, chatting about everything and nothing. He was more than a neighbor. He was a friend, a confidant, someone I knew I could always count on. We shared everything, from the first crush we ever had to our most embarrassing moments. Our relationship had always been comfortable, uncomplicated. Or at least, that's what I thought. Looking back now, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when things started to shift. Maybe it was during one of those late-night conversations when we sat on his porch, watching the stars and talking about our dreams for the future. Or maybe it was in the little moments we started to share, those accidental touches that seemed to linger longer than they should have. A hand on my shoulder after a long day, or the way his eyes would soften when he spoke to me, like he was seeing something no one else could. But I hadn't realized it then. It was only now, in the midst of that summer barbecue, that I could see the subtle changes between us. In those early years, we were inseparable. We spent every day after school together, running across the street to one another's houses without a second thought. Our parents were friends too, so it was normal for us to be constantly in and out of each other's homes. I can still remember the countless sleepovers, the nights we stayed up too late watching movies, or playing board games until we both fell asleep on the living room floor. There was always a sense of ease when I was with him. It was like we were always on the same wavelength, always laughing at the same jokes, finishing each other's sentences. But now, as we stood across from each other in the backyard, surrounded by the familiar faces of family, the air between us felt charged. I could feel it in the way Alex seemed to look at me, like he was noticing me for the first time. For so many years, we had shared a bond that was rooted in friendship, a friendship that never questioned boundaries. But now, those boundaries were beginning to feel blurred, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for the changes that might follow. The dynamic between us had always been easy. When we were younger, we didn't have to think about things like feelings or attraction. There was no pressure, no underlying tension, just the simple joy of being in each other's company. But now, I couldn't help but feel that something was shifting. Every conversation, every laugh, every shared moment seemed to carry a new weight. The more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. Our shared history was something I valued deeply. We had always been there for each other, whether it was offering support during tough times or celebrating each other's successes. It was easy to fall into that familiar rhythm, to lean on him when I needed a friend. But now, as the night wore on, I found myself questioning what I had always taken for granted. Was it possible that the connection we had built over the years could evolve into something more? Was I ready for that? And more importantly, was Alex? The awkwardness was palpable at times, but it was subtle, woven into the quiet moments that seemed to stretch on forever. The way his gaze would linger when I wasn't looking, or the way his voice softened whenever he addressed me. Our conversations had become more intimate, more personal, and I couldn't help but feel that there was something unspoken between us, a secret waiting to be discovered, though neither of us dared to speak it aloud. One particular moment from that barbecue stands out. We were standing near the grill, helping our dads with the food. The laughter of the other guests filled the air, but all I could focus on was the way Alex reached past me to grab the spatula. His hand brushed against mine, and for the briefest of moments, the world seemed to pause. I could feel the heat from the grill on my skin, but it was nothing compared to the warmth that spread through me at his touch. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight that I hadn't felt before. The tension between us was growing, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. My heart raced every time he spoke to me, and the way he smiled at me seemed different, more knowing. I tried to remind myself that this was just a phase, that it was nothing more than a temporary feeling brought on by the heat of the moment. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Our connection had always been effortless, but now, it felt complicated. Every moment spent with him seemed to stir something new inside me, an ache, a longing, a sense of something more. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I didn't know how to navigate the new dynamics between us. One moment, I was certain we could just continue on like we always had, but the next, I was questioning everything. What did this mean for our friendship? What would happen if I allowed myself to feel something deeper? The night went on, but I couldn't stop thinking about the unspoken changes between us. Alex was still the same guy I had known for years, the one who had been there for me through everything, the one who had always made me laugh, the one who had shared my most vulnerable moments. But now, he was someone else too, someone I wasn't sure I was ready to understand. The more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they crept in. I couldn't help but wonder if the friendship I had built with Alex could ever return to what it once was. Would we be able to laugh and joke the way we always had, or was everything going to be different now? And if it was, would that be so bad? In that moment, I realized that I couldn't deny what was happening anymore. The connection between us was undeniable, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was there, growing stronger with each passing second. And as much as I wanted to pretend everything was fine, I knew I had to face it, whatever it was. The evening had reached a comfortable level of warmth, with the last rays of sunlight slipping behind the horizon, leaving the backyard bathed in soft, golden light. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air, but all I could focus on was Alex. I hadn't realized how much I had been watching him until I found myself catching every movement, every glance in my direction. His laughter seemed louder than before, his voice softer, and when his eyes met mine, there was something there that hadn't been before. Something I couldn't quite place. The shift in our dynamic was so subtle at first that I almost dismissed it as nothing more than a passing phase. It began with small, unintentional touches, his hand brushing against mine as he handed me a drink, the brief contact that sent an unexpected spark racing through me. The kind of spark you can't ignore, no matter how much you try to convince yourself it's nothing. His smile had always been warm, but now, it seemed to hold an extra layer of meaning. It lingered in his eyes, a quiet invitation that I wasn't sure how to interpret. I found myself avoiding eye contact, not because I was uncomfortable, but because every time our gazes met, I felt like I was being pulled into something deeper. I couldn't tell if it was a shared feeling or if I was just imagining it. But there was something about the way he looked at me, something that made my heart race and my stomach flutter with anticipation. It wasn't just in the way he looked at me though. It was in the way he interacted with me, more deliberate, more focused. The playful banter we used to have now carried an edge of tension. When we joked around, it felt like there was more at stake, like we were saying things that carried more weight than we were used to. His laughter seemed more personal, and when I laughed with him, it felt like we were sharing a private joke that no one else could understand. And then, there were the moments when he would pull me aside to talk, away from the crowd. I couldn't tell if it was just casual conversation or if there was something more there, something unspoken. But I felt the change in the air every time. It wasn't like it used to be. Our conversations were deeper now, more intimate. He asked me about things he never had before, about my dreams, my fears, my thoughts on love. It was as if he was trying to see the real me, the me I had never shared with anyone else. One of those moments came after we had finished grilling. The others were gathered around the fire pit, chatting and roasting marshmallows, but Alex had pulled me aside, insisting he needed help with something in the garage. I followed him, not questioning it as I always did, but once we were inside, I could feel the tension building between us. "I don't need any help," he said, a playful smirk tugging at his lips as he turned to face me. "I just wanted to get away from all the noise for a bit." I nodded, unsure of what to say, but it didn't take long before the silence between us felt uncomfortable. It wasn't the comfortable silence we used to share, where we could sit in a room together without needing to fill the space with words. This silence was heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. "So," he began, leaning against the workbench, "how have you been? I haven't seen you in a while. You've been distant." I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out a little more nervous than I intended. "I'm not distant," I said, though I knew it wasn't entirely true. "I've just been busy. You know how it is." He nodded, but there was something about the way he studied me that made my heart skip a beat. It was like he was searching for something, like he was waiting for me to say something more. And for a brief moment, I wondered if he could see through the facade I had built. Could he sense that I was feeling something more than just friendship? Could he tell that I was fighting with the emotions I didn't want to acknowledge? Alex's gaze softened, and he pushed himself off the workbench, stepping closer to me. There was a shift in his posture, a subtle change that made the air between us crackle with tension. I couldn't look away as he closed the gap, his eyes never leaving mine. And for the first time that evening, I realized just how close we were, physically and emotionally. "I know we've been friends for a long time," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But sometimes I wonder if there's something more there. Something we haven't talked about." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, my heart pounding in my chest. It was like he had read my mind, like he knew exactly what I was feeling, but I wasn't ready to face it, not yet. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. My mind raced, trying to process what he had said, trying to find the right words to respond, but they wouldn't come. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat had gone dry. Instead, I just nodded, unable to trust my voice. Alex sighed softly, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite decipher. "I didn't mean to make things weird," he said, stepping back slightly. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about us lately." "About? What's next?" His words hung in the air, lingering like smoke, and I felt a pang of regret for not saying anything sooner, for not acknowledging the tension that had been building between us for so long. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore, but I knew I couldn't pretend that everything was the same. Something had changed, and I had to face it. As he turned to walk back toward the door, I felt the need to speak, to break the silence that had settled between us. But I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same way, that I had been struggling with these feelings for a long time. But instead, I stayed quiet, watching him as he walked away, wondering if I had missed my chance to say what had been on my mind. The shift was real, and it was undeniable. It was as though the world had tilted, and everything I thought I knew about our relationship was now in question. Whatever was happening between us, whatever had been happening for so long, was no longer something I could ignore. We were no longer just two friends hanging out in the backyard, joking and laughing. There was something more between us now, something that had to be addressed. And though I didn't have the answers, I knew one thing for sure: everything was about to change. The night had reached its peak. The sky was dotted with stars, but the warmth of the barbecue had slowly shifted into the coolness of the evening air. The atmosphere had changed too, lighter now, but still thick with unspoken words and lingering tension. The group had thinned out, some had gone home, others retired inside to the house. Alex and I were standing by the grill, the soft crackle of dying embers punctuating the otherwise quiet night. I had been trying to act normal, pretending that everything was just as it had always been, but I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened earlier in the garage. Every time I saw Alex, I felt a sudden heat flush through me, a mixture of guilt and longing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was no way to go back to pretending that nothing had changed, because everything had changed. "I think I'll head inside soon," Alex said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. He shifted his weight slightly, his posture more relaxed than it had been all evening, but his eyes were still sharp, focused on me. I nodded absently, trying to push away the knot forming in my stomach. The whole night had felt like a series of almosts, almost saying the right thing, almost letting my feelings show. But now, standing there in the fading light, I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't felt it too, the shift between us, the new energy, the new tension. I had to say something before I lost my chance. "Alex," I said quietly, my voice breaking slightly. He turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. I felt my heart hammer in my chest, and my mouth suddenly went dry. It wasn't just the alcohol that had made me nervous. It was everything. "Yeah," he replied, his tone soft but tinged with curiosity. He took a small step closer, and I immediately felt the change in the air between us. The air, thick with unspoken words, now felt almost suffocating. I took a deep breath. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it anymore." The words hung between us, heavy and raw. For a moment, I couldn't read his expression. His lips pressed together as if he was thinking, calculating. His eyes flickered toward the ground and back to mine, and I could see the storm of emotions brewing within him. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He seemed to be playing it off, but there was a subtle edge there, a tension in his shoulders I hadn't noticed before. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to back away from what I had just said. But it was too late now. The words were out there, and I had to face them. "I'm talking about everything," I said, my voice stronger this time. "About the way things have been between us. About the way I feel when I'm around you. I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend it's nothing." Alex's face softened, his eyes darting away for a moment, as though he were processing what I had said. He took a step back, as though he needed space to think. I felt a pang of anxiety rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still, to hold his gaze. "I felt it too," he finally said, his voice low and almost hesitant. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't help but exhale in relief. I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to make things weird between us, but it's been there. It's been there for a while. I could feel the weight of his words settle on my chest, and I realized how long we had both been holding back, afraid of what it might mean for our friendship. For so long, we had danced around it, trying to ignore the growing tension between us. But now here we were, standing on the edge of something neither of us could ignore anymore. "Then why didn't we say anything?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Why did we wait so long?" Alex rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice tight. I guess I was afraid. I didn't want to ruin what we had. I didn't want to risk losing you." There it was, the fear that had held us both back. The fear of what acknowledging the truth would do to everything we had built. But the longer we kept this silent, the more it was eating us alive, slowly and quietly. I was afraid too, I confessed, feeling my walls crumble. Afraid that it would ruin everything. But I can't keep pretending I don't want more. I can't keep pretending that seeing you smile doesn't make my heart race, or that hearing your laugh doesn't make me feel like I'm home. His eyes flickered with something, softness, vulnerability, and then he stepped closer. This time, I didn't step back. We stood there, just a breath away from each other, the air between us charged with everything we had never said, with everything we had been afraid to feel. "I don't want to lose you either," Alex murmured, and the sincerity in his voice hit me like a wave. His hand found mine, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The laughter, the music, the buzz of the party, all of it faded into the background as we stood there, just the two of us, facing something we could no longer deny. "Then what do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know if I was asking for reassurance, or if I was just trying to make sense of everything that had changed between us in the span of an hour. Alex didn't say anything at first. He simply squeezed my hand, a quiet reassurance, and then his lips parted, as if he was about to say something more. But before he could, I found myself leaning in, drawn to him like gravity pulling me in. Our lips met in a kiss, slow, tentative at first, as though neither of us quite believed this was real. But the moment our mouths touched, the tension between us exploded, and all the fear, all the hesitation, melted away. It was everything I had imagined, and more. The warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips, the way his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer. This was no longer just a moment of curiosity or confusion. It was a declaration, one that we had both been too afraid to make. When we finally broke apart, breathless and a little dazed, I looked into his eyes. And for the first time, I saw everything, the vulnerability, the uncertainty, but also the hope. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. What now? I asked again, my voice barely audible. Alex smiled, his hand still holding mine. We figure it out, he said quietly, his thumb brushing against my palm. Together. In that moment, it felt like the world had finally fallen into place. The following morning, the sun crept through the curtains of my bedroom, casting a soft golden hue across the room. My mind felt like a jumble of emotions, confusion, excitement, fear, and a quiet sense of relief. The events of the previous night had shifted everything between Alex and me, but in a way I hadn't expected. I had never thought something so simple, so raw, could change so much between us. I sat up in bed, feeling the weight of the moment pressing against my chest. I had kissed Alex. He had kissed me back. It felt real, too real, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was prepared for what came next. The air between us had changed, and I didn't know where it was going. But the uncertainty didn't feel like a burden. It felt like possibility. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted up from the backyard, and I realized the barbecue had continued after Alex and I had stepped away. I could hear familiar voices, friends mingling, unaware of the shift that had just happened between their two closest friends. Between me and Alex. I slowly stood, pulling on a t-shirt before making my way downstairs. The house felt different this morning, more like mine than it ever had. The sense of change was subtle but undeniable. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, but something had shifted in my very bones. As I rounded the corner to the kitchen, I found Alex standing by the counter, a cup of coffee in his hand, his back to me. His hair was slightly tousled from sleep, his eyes tired but warm, and for a moment, I forgot all the questions swirling in my head. He looked up as I entered, offering me a soft smile that made my heart skip. It was a smile that told me more than words ever could. There was warmth in it, a sense of security. But there was still hesitation in his eyes too. His expression said it all. Things between us were different now, but we both knew we needed to take it one step at a time. "Morning," Alex greeted me, his voice low and inviting, like he was still figuring out how to speak in this new, vulnerable space we had created. "Morning," I replied, my voice a little rougher than I intended. I glanced at the coffee pot on the counter, suddenly realizing how much I needed something to steady me. I walked over, pouring myself a cup, the silence stretching between us. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just new. We both lingered in the quiet, unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic. The kiss hadn't come with a roadmap. There was no clear next step, no guidebook on how to move from this moment to the next. "You okay?" Alex asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, and there was a trace of concern in it. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same uncertainty reflected in his gaze. It was like we were both standing on the same cliff, unsure whether to jump, but knowing we couldn't stay in limbo forever. I took a deep breath, setting the cup down on the counter. "Yeah, I think I'm okay. Just processing. Everything's different now, isn't it?" He nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah. But I think it's a good kind of different. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't regret it. I just don't want us to rush into anything." The honesty in his words settled over me like a gentle rain, soothing the worries that had been building since the kiss. I realized then that we were both approaching this carefully, thoughtfully. We didn't need to rush. What mattered was that we were finally facing the truth of how we felt about each other. "I don't want to rush either," I confessed, meeting his gaze. "I don't want to lose what we have, but I also don't want to keep pretending like nothing's changed." Alex's lips curved upward into that smile I had come to love. It was small, hesitant, but it was real. And it was all I needed to see. "Yeah, I get that," he said softly. Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. We just take it one step at a time, see where it goes. His words hung in the air, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We didn't have to have all the answers. We didn't have to define what was happening between us right away. All we had to do was take that first step, then another and another. There was no rush, no expectation, no pressure. We'll figure it out together, I said, the words feeling right. No matter what comes next, we'll figure it out. Alex reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The simple touch sent a shiver down my spine, but in the best way. It was like a promise, unspoken, but understood. I like the sound of that, he murmured, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. As we stood there, side by side, I realized that there were no guarantees in life, no promises that things would always work out the way we wanted. But what I did know was that we had something real. Something worth exploring. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was ours to walk together. The day stretched on, and we joined the others outside, slipping back into our roles as friends. Only now there was something more. A quiet understanding. A new layer to our connection. The barbecue continued, the sound of laughter and chatter filling the air, but all I could focus on was the feel of Alex's hand brushing against mine every now and then, the subtle glances that lingered longer than before. Things were different, and though the uncertainty still hovered between us, there was also something beautiful about it. The vulnerability. The honesty. The unknown. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I wasn't afraid of the questions or the uncertainty. I was ready for whatever it was that came with this new chapter. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the backyard, I couldn't help but smile. I didn't know what the future held, but with Alex by my side, I was ready to face it. Together. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes, the best stories are the ones we don't plan. The ones that unfold in their own time, in their own way. All we have to do is show up and let the journey take us wherever it's meant to go. We would figure it out. Together.